Good evening, everyone, and welcome to today's event. My name is Elliot Kola, and I'm the chair of the Department of Arabic and Islamic Studies here at Georgetown University. And on my behalf and behalf of my colleague, Professor Killian Clark here, who's an assistant professor here at the Center of Contemporary Arab Studies, it is my great pleasure to introduce Yasmin El-Rifae to discuss her new book, Radius, A Story of Feminist Revolution. Yasmin El-Rifae, for those who don't know her, is a writer and an editor. Her first book, Radius, is in our hands here. It's a narrative history of the militant feminist group Opantish within the Egyptian Revolution and the role they played and the role that violence against women revolutionaries played during that period. And the book has just been published. She recently moved to London from Cairo, where she worked with the independent newspaper, in fact, the only independent newspaper in Egypt right now, Mada Masr, which is where I first read Yasmin El-Rifae, and so it's such a pleasure to finally meet you in person. I think I've met you before, but not yet. At Mada Masr, I think.
Exactly.
She's also the co-producer of the Palestine Festival of Literature, which over the years has, I don't know if anybody's had a chance to see it, is really worth taking a look. They've done some amazing events there. Yasmin tonight will be presenting her book and reading from several passages, followed by questions from myself and from Killian. We'll then open up the floor to questions. If you're joining us in person, simply just raise your hand and we will address as many of your questions as possible. If you're joining us online, please ask your questions using the Zoom Q&A feature, and our events manager will direct them to me. If you have any technical issues, please email coco.tate@georgetown.edu. This information will all be in the chat as well, in case you need it. If you're interested in purchasing Yasmin's book, Georgetown's bookstore is selling copies right outside the boardroom right now, or you can follow the link in the Zoom chat. Okay, so please join me in welcoming Yasmin to Georgetown.
Thank you all for coming, and thank you for having me and for helping set all this up. So I'm going to start by reading just for a couple of minutes from the very beginning of the book. There is an introduction, a short introduction, but I'm going to read from the beginning of chapter 1. January 25th, 2013, 11 o'clock a.m. In her living room, T took the newly printed t-shirts out of the plastic bags they'd come in. She held one up and ran her fingers along the curled letters stenciled into red block on the front. Against assault, the text said in Arabic. Farida had designed the logo a couple of weeks ago in this same room. It has to be strong and simple, she'd said, her brow scrunched as her fingers moved on the mouse pad. There were 75 t-shirts for T to take to the intervention teams. As she packed them into a black duffel bag, she wondered how many people would actually show up. She went into her bedroom and opened her closet. A blue Post-it note that had been stuck to the closet door lost the last of its glue and fluttered to the ground. A note from Adam. Buy light bulbs, ! In his small, meticulous cursive. She liked the marks that were left by people and by the work that they did together. Her apartment was on the 11th floor of a building just a few blocks away from Tahrir Square. And for the past 2 years, the place had been totally open to the world that was changing outside. People worked in her living room, sometimes on her balcony. It had functioned as a meeting space for nascent political initiatives, a hideout and a refuge. On her fridge, on the walls, underneath her bed, were sketches that later became posters, maps of protest routes, drawings and doodles made during conversations. There were t-shirts and scarves and hoodies belonging to various friends that were mixed up in her own wardrobe. People slept in her bed and cooked in her kitchen. Nahia kept a pair of pajama pants here. T took off her jeans and pulled on a pair of long johns, and on top of them, a blue one-piece swimsuit, a base layer of protection, hard to remove, impossible to rip. She pulled the straps up over her shoulders, feeling the tightness around her chest. The restriction, normally uncomfortable, was now reassuring. She put a black tank top on over it, then her t-shirt. She pulled her jeans back on over the long john swimsuit combination. She planned to be with the so-called safety teams who take care of survivors once they had been pulled out of a mob. They were supposed to stand near the intervention teams, but to stay on the outside of the crowd, to not get pulled into the fighting. But T had learned to be ready just in case. Things changed quickly, and she didn't want to find herself unprepared. Her worn-out old Nikes would come off too easily. She reached in the back of her closet for a pair of heavy boots that she hardly ever wore. Then she went to the mirror, thinking about her hair. A ponytail would be too easy to pull, an obvious target. She could pin it up and tie a scarf around it, pirate style. Yes, that will do. At night, she'd pull the hood of her hoodie on too. Il-dakhliya, baltaghiya. Cops are thugs, is what that translates into. The unmistakable rhythmic sound of chanting voices suddenly filled her bedroom. It was earlier than usual. Friday prayers had not even begun. It sounded like a small group, perhaps too eager to wait for the day's activity to kick off. The sound moved past her, on its way, she assumed, to Tahrir. It had been 2 years since mass protests broke out in 2011. Just like that, when they had least expected it, when the stasis and corruption and police brutality underneath a veneer of slick neoliberal reforms had all but hollowed out any sense of imagination or political possibility, it was here, an actual revolutionary upheaval that threw Hosni Mubarak out of his 30-year presidency. In the 2 years of ongoing leaderless protest, Tahrir remained the symbolic heart of the revolution. It was here that the first marches headed on January 25th, and it was here that they returned 3 days later, after 100 police stations were burnt to the ground around the country, after the government's attempt to stop what had begun, including shutting down cell phone lines and the internet, did nothing to stop millions more from coming out onto the streets. Through each victory and each setback since, the feeling was that if Tahrir was lost, the whole dream of change would be lost with it. The way the revolution had become the center of T's life, had become her life, was matter of fact, inevitable. She looked at her outfit. Good enough. So I feel like most of the people here and probably online are a bit more familiar with the context around this, but I'll just quickly place where and when the scene is happening and what's happening around it. So this is precisely the second anniversary of the 2011 revolution. So the 2011 protests achieved some very quick sort of political goalposts that nobody expected it to. Within 18 days, famously, Hosni Mubarak had stepped down, and the military took over for a transitional period, and then popular elections were held that brought the Muslim Brotherhood to power. And it's the Muslim Brotherhood leading the country, at least in its sort of executive functions, when this scene takes place. But through those 2 years, there was ongoing sort of, strike action, mass protest around the country. And as I said, Tahrir remained the sort of most important symbolic space, let's say. And Tahrir was certainly itself constantly filled with rallies and occasionally in more at moments when there weren't direct political calls for things. It was just a space that was constantly filled with people, basically. And towards the end of 2012, so in October and November 2012, we started to see a pattern of mob sexual assaults against women protesters in Tahrir. So a sort of violence that would look like a small group of men, sometimes only 3 or 4, would encircle a woman, usually separate her from whoever she had been with, and begin inflicting various forms and levels of violence on her. And the distinct thing that kept repeating itself was that what would start off as a very small group would very quickly grow into a crowd of varying sizes, sometimes hundreds of people. And these crowds were incredibly chaotic, incredibly confused and confusing. It was very hard to tell sometimes who was doing what, who was joining in the violence, who was trying to help, who was there like pickpocketing, who was simply there. You know, lots of times people were just sort of filming on their phones, like not really. Sometimes it was also hard to see what was happening in a crowd of that size. And so, yeah, it started to become a daily occurrence. Many people saw it happening themselves, had it happen to themselves. And in response, and then women also, importantly, women started writing and posting their testimonies online about what had happened to them, and also witnesses. So men and women who had seen something found it important to just document what they had seen to the best of their ability and put it online. And so in response to this, a few groups of people started organizing themselves into these sort of just groups, squads that would go out into Tahrir and start scanning the crowds to see if they could see something happening, and then to try and help with very little plan. And one of these, I think of these as a sort of, I don't know, the like spontaneous precursors from which these more organized groups like Opantish built themselves. So the first time I went out with one of these first spontaneous groups or precursor groups, we had pink ribbons that we tied around our arms to sort of help us spot one another. We didn't all know one another per se. And from there, we came together to think of a name for the group. Eventually we had t-shirts, we had a Facebook page and a Twitter handle, and, you know, started circulating wider calls for volunteers. And slowly learned how to deal with the violence better, how to better protect ourselves. Many people, women in particular, were hurt and targeted themselves in the course of trying to help other people. It is important to note and to know and to recognize that there were other groups that did this kind of work. One of them was called Tahrir Bodyguards, for example. And the reason, so I've written about Opantish because I was part of it and that was my experience. But also the thing that was a bit distinct about Opantish was that it identified itself not only as a sort of emergency response group, that was trying to rescue women from this violence, but also that was trying to really say, it considered itself part of the revolution, and it considered itself its mission to sort of fight for women's ability to be full participants in political action and in revolutionary action. And it saw part of its work to sort of push that into the center of the wider revolution. And part of the difficulty that we faced at the beginning, unfortunately, came from other revolutionary activists and groups who at first didn't want to acknowledge that the violence was happening, let alone help do something about it. And that is something we can talk about more. I think it's a common experience beyond this one, in revolutions, in leftist organizing and institutions. So that's sort of a bit more about what the book is about and what was sort of happening at the time that this group was active.
Great, that is a fine opening.
Thanks.
Are you ready for questions?
I'm very ready for questions.
Get the ball rolling, or?
Sure. I just want to say first, Yasmin, this is a marvelous book. I read it over the last week, and at some points I couldn't put it down. It's really fantastic. And it's gripping and riveting in, all the ways you'd expect it to be given the topic of the book is. So I have a lot of questions, but I guess I'll start off with a question that you only really get to in the book about halfway through. And I actually liked that because you start off micro, right? You start off first with this fantastic first chapter that you read us a passage from, which is just about January 25th, 2013, right? The 2-year anniversary of the revolution, which tells this story of the square turning into this utter space of horror. And then you sort of slowly zoom out from there. And eventually about halfway through the book, we get the sort of the revolution, the transition, the context. And so, and I'm a political scientist, so I think in macro terms. So even though I like the way you wrote the book, I was like, okay, good, macro, get my hand around this. But I guess the question I had up until then, I thought you answered it well in the book, and maybe there isn't a good answer, is why did this happen when it did, right? Why in November, December 2012 did these mobs start to form, and why did it become so intense, so violent, so quickly? And then why, after the coup, after Rabah, I mean, the protest stopped, but it seems to have dissipated.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And maybe there's no good answer to this, but that was a question I had.
Sure. No, I mean, it's in many ways one of the most, in some ways, unanswerable and most kind of the question that weighs on us, and one that, we spent a long time talking about. But I think there are a few different ways to look at it. I think macro, I think violence against women is often, and especially sexualized violence against women, is often a part of political conflicts, wars, revolutions. And I think that perhaps there was something about the sort of the space that Tahrir was, this sort of staging ground spectacle that kept kind of changing as the political, what was happening in, sort of formal politics and other, other things happening around the country were changing. Its spirit kept changing over and over again. And it was the one thing that was constant was that it was filled with crowds. It was filled with crowds. And the other part of the picture would be that Egypt, sexual violence is a universal force, a universal happening. It's one that happens every day in most places. Egypt has a deep history, an ongoing one of problems with sexual harassment in public spaces in particular. We'd seen something like mob assaults in celebratory gatherings around the Eid in the mid-2000s, which many bloggers exposed and took to dealing with online. And then at celebrations of football matches and things like this. So it was something that had happened in these kind of isolated ways before. But the fact, this recurrence, right, and the establishing of a pattern was what was so different at this time. And of course, what that meant for the future of the revolution and for its ability to continue and for women's ability to continue to participate. And one of the things that Opantish decided quite early on in terms of both a tactical and a political decision was to not be to explicitly not try to identify perpetrators in the crowd. And that was for several reasons. One was that it was very hard to do that with any certainty. And one of the things that was so deeply troubling about what we saw and what many, many women experienced in the course of these attacks or in the course of trying to intervene in them was that men would often say they were going to help a woman and then attack her, or in some way, in some instances, actually be doing both at the same time. So be helping to physically move her body out of the crowd while also sort of having a hand down her trousers or something like that. So this issue of trying to figure out who was doing what and of trying to punish men, for example, who people believed might be part of the violence, was something that we decided we weren't going to do. And another part of the reason and the thinking behind this was that we quickly also learned and tried to learn that that it was important to not contribute to the escalation of the violence. And so to not sort of get stuck fighting and have volunteers get hurt or sometimes, hurt worse than they already were. And so to try and, as much as possible, not make things more violent than they were. And I think that was really liberating. And I think it really allowed us to keep the focus on getting to the people being hurt and getting out of there, just getting out and leaving as quickly as possible. And I do see an echo, or I see some usefulness in that as a strategy that could be applied in trying to deal with issues of sexual violence in different contexts as well. I think we get, not that we shouldn't be thinking about why it happens or who's doing it and why, but I just think that oftentimes when we're directly involved in trying to think about safeguarding or, experimenting with like alternative justice models or transitional justice models, it can be really, we can get bogged down a bit too much in looking at punishment rather than keeping the lens on the people who it's happening to themselves and what we can sort of do in response, right? Yeah.
So I just want to pick up on this in maybe a slightly oblique way, but I also want to just thank you for writing this. People like me depend on your insights and your articulation of problems. For me, reading this was devastating. I know that the Egyptian revolution was violent. And yet we're just bombarded with these images of like the 18 days, but the story that it was peaceful, unlike say Libya or something like that, right? And you're just laying out in well-documented terms, but at a human level, this was the stories in here. I'm trying to say I also had to put the book down. I also couldn't put the book down. I found I was sucked in. So anyway, thank you for the instruction and there's a part of it I found so refreshing, and this is my question, is that you're in dealing with sexual violence and in a revolution. We were talking earlier about political science as a discipline, and just thinking this as a discipline. I won't trash political science here. I'll do that later. I'll do that later. But in order just to understand the history, we immediately, it's all about politics, but it immediately we're in something else. We're in interpersonal relationships. This is a story of activists working together, and they're doing politics together. And you're reminding us, no one is doing politics. No one is a revolutionary. No one's even an activist without being a human being first, interacting with other people, right? So there's this. Immediately, we find this collective, individual, and even interpersonal kind of dynamics that are so intertwined that I can't tell where revolution starts or where it stops, and where the group dynamics start, and where you or Farida or T, where their therapy begins. And because there's such a reluctance to recognize that violence does things to people, right? And this book is a testament to that. That for me, that this is a huge corrective to the history, and it's a troubling one because I don't really know what to like to do. There's no happy ending here, but it does say we have to, in terms of academics, we have to be interdisciplinary. In other words, we need to be engaging multiple kinds of questions at the same time because they're all interlocking here. But I'm just wondering about because this book is not about the 18 days. It's about the reverberation of these events, right, and into now, right? So it's a book about the aftermath. In fact, much more, and it's written from the point of view say wanting to do justice to what is it like to go through a revolutionary experience and lose, right? And then you experience that on the individual level or the small group level. So is anything what I'm saying making sense? Like where did in Opantish, like you're telling stories about gender politics within the organization that like I think anyone needs to just think about or read but they are so familiar to every group I've ever been in. We just don't talk about it. Was this situation so extreme on an individual level and on a level of body, right? That these these entanglements could never be disentangled. I mean, there are people who write about this, not just academics. There are memoirs that do not get into any of what you get into here. I've read lots and lots of memoirs that act as if this was all heroism. And this is a messy story.
Right. Okay.
That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I think I really didn't want to write a story about heroes. I think there was a lot of bravery in this. There was a lot of fear, a lot of mistakes were made. We learned a lot. And I think I don't know how useful a story about heroes doing something like this would be, because I think that I wanted it to be a sort of useful account, and not a sort of blueprint or anything, I mean, but a useful account in terms of for people who want to think about direct action, who want to think about whether it's in terms of, fighting sexual violence or anything else, but also more broadly about doing collective work, collective political work in a situation where there's, political convulsion around you all the time, because it was dealing with those differences, right? It was a collective thing. We were all there's always this kind of paradox in this story of being united around the singular mission of saving women from sexual violence, unimpeachable, right? Like everybody would say, yes, I want to do that. But the context and what was happening around us made this a deeply divisive task in terms of how people wanted to do it. And even that changed over time, and what tools they wanted to use, whether or not they wanted to engage the justice system, whether or not they thought women should be on the front lines, whether or not, once the context started to shift and Tahrir slowly became a sort of pro-military space, whether Opantish should continue going out and doing the work that it had been doing. And I think I found from the very little reading that I did that this kind of, also differences of opinion when it came to how to structure decision-making within the group and whether to have a kind of vanguard, core team making top-down decisions, or whether to try and open it up to something a bit more democratic. And
yeah, the thing there's these arguments that you're narrating between men and women, or the roles of men and women in Opantish, right? Mm-hmm. And it's too dangerous for women to go out there, and the discovery that women have to be in the team because men cannot. Do you mind just talking about that? Because you get into to detail here that most people don't get into, and the detail really helps to elucidate what the problem is.
Sure, yeah, and this also brings it back to the issue of crowds, which was one part of the macro thing I was trying to, picture I was trying to look at in answer to your question. So one of the things we learned was that women who were being attacked by crowds were often, because of their sort of physiological response to what was going on, were in a state that it was like to the point where they, and again, because men would often say they were going to help them, but then hurt them and so on, like they couldn't trust any man, even if it was a man that they knew. They oftentimes wouldn't even recognize men that they knew who showed up and tried to help them. It was like a shutting down of some kind to self-protect. And it was only when, in so many cases we heard this, it was only when they heard a woman's voice or saw a woman's face, made eye contact with a woman, that they were able to trust another person enough to start moving their bodies in a way that allowed for being removed from the situation. And so the strategy, the sort of insistent strategy of having women be on the front line, so to speak, or doing this kind of first being at the front of the line of people trying to break through the crowd. It wasn't just a political stance of insisting on women's rights to volunteer in whatever capacity they wanted to, even though it was at risk of becoming targeted themselves, but also it was an effectiveness issue. And some of the other groups doing this work, like Tahrir Bodyguards, at first didn't have women in their on the ground teams because they thought it was too dangerous, but eventually sort of followed what Opantish had done and started figuring out how to incorporate women into that work, because it sort of wasn't working otherwise, or wasn't working as well as it could. So
I wanted to ask also about the organizational point, Yasmin. I found some of that discussion really interesting. It felt like there were all of these tensions within Opantish. So on the one hand, this really narrow focus that you described earlier, right? Get in, get out, get the woman, pull her out, that's it, right? No punishment, no justice, right? We're not dealing with courts, we're not dealing with cops, we're not dealing with, any of that. But then this also, quite expansive aspiration to be a revolutionary group, not just a feminist group, but a revolutionary group, and to try to model some kind of revolutionary action or practice that wasn't being realized, right, with the way the transition had been going. And then also the tensions you alluded to about sort of how to structure a group like that, right, how to be democratic, but also how to have a leadership, right? There were clearly a kind of cohort of founders. I think some of them are the people, the characters in the book who had a hard time letting go, right? So do we have a vanguard, or do we have rotation? Do we have democracy? Can you talk a little bit more about what the aspirations of Opantish were? What were the goals?
Yeah, so Opantish started at the end of 2012. The coup happened in the summer of 2013. So it was only actually consistently active for about 8 months. Very sort of intense, brief happenings, and towards the end of the revolution as it was happening on the ground. And I think that in slower moments during that period, we talked a lot about what we could do to try and take the energy and the mobilization that we had achieved, right? It was this feeling of we had this kind of the contacts of a few hundred people who were ready to kind of go out and volunteer. And so we, of course we thought, well, what else can we do with this energy other than, than what we were already doing? But I think that, you know, at the time, what was happening politically around us was so volatile and happening so fast and so confusing. And like, this was the moment of sort of, you know, the build up to the coup. So the Brotherhood, like, very quickly just losing popular legitimacy, you know, emergence of like sectarian violence. There was just so much happening all the time. And we were never really able to go beyond Tahrir. And people also, you know, in the slower moments had to sort of allow themselves to fall apart, right? This was when everyone kind of like allowed themselves to collapse and, you know, and then put themselves back together once it was needed. But what did happen sort of spontaneously was that groups of people in other cities wanted to set up their own kind of outfits that sort of followed Pantish's model. And so I know a couple of times people went and, you know, spoke to people in other cities and towns. And then sometimes things would be happening in that way that we wouldn't know about till later. And then somebody would like message us and say, hey, we went out and did this. But then it was also there was a feeling of needing to fight on the level of discourse, right? On the level of insisting that this be part of the story of the revolution as it was happening at the time. And so we did all kinds of media work. I mean, people were on like Bassem Youssef's show, which was huge at the time. And I do think that there was a national conversation about it at some point that left a mark.
So like, I'm thinking about this, in fact, just because I'm reading a lot of literature about trauma, and that's on my mind. And so many of the scenes you describe, including the one, you know, of women frozen because of what's happening to them. Like this just resonates so much with that literature. And one of the things about trauma has to do with what it does to time, for instance, you know. So writing this book and kind of thinking these things through and doing the kind of self-care, and all mad props to the Audre Lorde that you're dropping here. This is all really good stuff. To me, it seems like this is what we need to be doing in our country too, you know. But what as you kind of work through the aftermath on whatever level, however you experience it, what sort of truths become clearer now than they were, say, back then? I mean, the insight and understanding is working very strangely as I get older, and I find some things become easier to see with time in ways I did not before. I'm just wondering for you, as in this experience of writing this.
Yeah, I mean, I think there were things that became clear over time in the way that happens, but also in the course of talking to people in the interviews that I did for the book. And I think I'll say that when I started writing and when I started asking people to have conversations with me about their experiences with Opantish, I didn't really know what I was going to do with it. I was sort of like, I think everything had ended so abruptly after the coup and like the banning of protests. And so we had stopped going out as a group. And then, as was the case for everybody who had been involved in the revolution in one way or another, we had to deal with the sort of sudden, the break from the collective to sort of as individuals dealing with the trauma, right? And then losing the spaces and the events and the sort of the reasons that would pull us together as the sort of repression very quickly took hold and changed the city. And I felt desperate to talk to the other people who I'd done this work with, to know what they were thinking and how they, how they remembered it, how they were doing. And yeah, and in the course of those conversations, I learned things that I hadn't realized at all. Like I didn't know, for example, that one of the strategies, we would usually have about like 4 intervention teams on the ground, and over time they became, teams with consistent volunteers like this. So mostly the same people would show up time and time again. And one of the teams, which was not one of the ones that I ever went out with, had been doing this thing of that I describe in one of the chapters that Adam recounts to me of effectively trying to, when encountering somebody in the crowd, dealing with them as though we assumed that they were there to try and help, even if it looked like somebody who was directly hurting someone else, to sort of say, hey, I know you're here to help. And then seeing people switch. And the way that they learned that was because women had said that men had helped and hurt them at the same time. And so they took that and sort of used it to say, well, maybe we can, if we sort of give people the space and say, hey, like, will you help me? I know you're here trying to help. Why don't you join us? Like, I've got a team. And this actually worked like a fair number of times. And that just kind of blew my mind. And I had no idea. Like, I knew we were trying to not escalate. I knew this thing, but I didn't know people were doing that. So the conversations were everything. I mean, the book wouldn't exist without them. I wasn't interested in writing. Yeah, like I said, I didn't know, some of the initial emails I wrote to people, I sort of say, I don't know if this is going to be an article or maybe a book. Like, I wasn't sure. And then I had no idea what form the book would take, but I did know that I didn't want to be the central like narrative voice throughout. And that was because I felt like what had happened was so big and sort of kaleidoscopic, and there, it was this shifting organism all the time that like grew and shrunk and changed structure, and everybody's experience seemed to be very different from one another depending on when they came in and when they left, and whether they were a man or a woman or non-binary, or so
that really comes through. It feels it's not an ethnography, it's not a study, it's a collective memoir. It reads like a collective memoir. These voices are that you really succeeded in that. Does that relate to the title? I'm so curious. So there are lots of moments where you kind of speak about circles, and maybe that would be, and I want to also thank you. You're the first person who spoke to the truth of Tahrir Square, which is before January 20th, like a truth that I knew, but I was so surprised. I was running around trying to tell people, you don't understand. This is a place you go to cross. You don't go to, like, this is just a giant traffic lot. And I'm so glad that you point out, and I'm assuming that's related to the traffic, well, what I was reading as a traffic circle that kind of vaguely looks like.
This is lifted from a map of Tahrir.
Yeah, so radius.
Well, radius, I have to say, is not I'm very bad at titles. My partner, Omar Hamilton, who you know, is very good at titles. And so radius came out of a conversation that we had when the book was almost finished, actually. So after many years of working on it, and I'd had sort of placeholder titles before, and we were driving from Cairo to Sahel, and decided to use the time to brainstorm for a title. And yeah, the theme of circles was very, I understood that circles were there. And so the conversation was all
mob violence. You guys are forming circles of protection.
Yeah, and also like the first direct reference is to eventually we found a sort of formation for how the intervention teams should move through the crowds, and it involved creating a safe corridor and a safe corridor that would get to the woman in the middle, and then a small group, usually of women, would get to her, put her in the middle of them, and then go back out. So radius is like about the physical thing of getting to the middle and coming back out. And it also alludes metaphorically to trying to break tendencies to circle conversations about sexual violence and sort of women's issues in general, to circle them away, to disconnect them from other things, from other political questions and issues and forces. And it also has to do with the sort of some circularities of memory and trauma, and how those can work, and trying to kind of accept them, but also break them sometimes. And just now in hearing your question, I think maybe also there's something there to needing to get out of Tahrir, which I hadn't actually thought about before. This is one of the amazing things I'm finding about talking about this book. Is like I'm like realizing things about it that I, even after working on it for so long, that seemed quite obvious, but I hadn't worked out. But yeah, needing to breaking out of Tahrir, and actually, you know, how much did the sort of obsessive need to sort of hang on to a particular identity of it, or a particular spatial association with it, end up hurting the movement? I don't know.
It seems being obsessive is pretty appropriate for being involved in a revolution, though. It's pretty consuming.
Yeah. Well, that's back to the issue of leadership and not letting go of, the core group and the sort of driving decision-making group within Opantish. One of the real concerns was how easily it could be co-opted, the way that, oftentimes fights and conversations around women's bodies have a tendency of getting co-opted, but particularly because of this, we were headed towards this extreme polarization where we were already divided around questions of what to do with the brotherhood, essentially, and what
did get co-opted.
Yeah, and it was a popular coup. It's very, very important to remember how the street was used to justify the coup, the massacre at Rabaa, and all of that. And I think as much as, I felt it was important to lay out the divisions and the arguments as they happened, but I do think, I don't think there was another way of doing it. And I think that Opantish could have very easily turned into a sort of pro-CC, men saving women sort of thing. And then I don't know if I would have written that book then.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I guess, my question is related to the last point when sort of like in 2012, 2015, I was still a preteen and a teenager. So I remember hearing the word taharrush, harassment, a lot, and learning about what it means and the implications of it. But then later, as sort of an outsider who was too young to participate at the moment, I sort of went back to this time, and I feel that the violence was not just the physical harassment and assault that happened in Tahrir or other spaces, but the violence happened on a larger scale through media and social media, where the bodies of women were used more or less as a political bargaining chip, where suddenly to sort of create an anti-brotherhood narrative.
Absolutely. Yeah.
people started caring or pretended to care about women and their safety in the public, and sort of even their accessibility to some spaces where it might be too dangerous. And then like I also remembered about how people were telling women not to go to Tahrir because it's too dangerous for them, as early as during the 18 days. So do you think that the violence that happened on the street was reflective of the violence that was happening on the mass media scale, or was it that they both sort of happened?
It's an important question. I don't know if I can answer it like in a satisfying way, but I do think that it's an important dynamic and relationship to think about, because it was very quickly politically utilized. And, you know, from what you described and also from the Brotherhood saying, well, this is the ragtag, like dirty opposition, and this is how they treat their protesters. And women who come to our protest spaces don't have any problem with this, right? So it was, that was a big part of what was happening. Whether it encouraged and perpetuated the violence, maybe. It might have. But yeah, I think again, that was the way that we dealt with it at the time, was to sort of just focus on the response, right? And on also the issues and the sort of denial that was happening from people who we had considered like revolutionary comrades or allies, and to try and push it to the center of that work somehow.
I have a small follow-up question, but it was discussed that Tahrir, we like sort of like now, right now, people either have this extremely negative view of Tahrir or this sort of overly positive view of Tahrir as this almost utopian space where people took to the streets and sort of controlled the space for the first time. But then like works like this and statements like this open up the discussion of how like our memories sort of skip the negative parts of a movement like this, and then there's this thing where people are afraid of people who were part of the revolution or people who supported the revolution are afraid to touch upon the negative of Tahrir itself, not just the political mechanisms, but Tahrir as the space. So first, I would like to thank you for keeping the memory of Tahrir alive, not in a positive way, not just in a positive way, but in a true way. But the question is whether you think assessments of the past like this could be useful going forward, or useful to understand what happened better.
I hope so. I mean, I think it's there hasn't been enough for many reasons. There hasn't been enough real self-interrogation is a really sharp term, but it's the only one that comes to mind. But let's say, yeah, reflection, questioning, that has had public or productive outlets. I think a lot of people have sort of done this themselves, or maybe in small groups, but certainly publicly and collectively, we haven't really had that space or that much of it to ask these questions of ourselves and of each other. And that's incredibly painful. It's an incredible social pain and individual pain for many communities that lived through these experiences. And I can say for, the people I spoke to from Opantish, they feel an ongoing sort of like as if it's been left out of the commemoration, right? So even when people would try like commemorate or talk about anniversaries of different like revolutionary battles or moments or tragedies, they just still felt like this was unacknowledged as a political experience, as a revolutionary sort of injury for those of them who'd been injured. And this is, of course, a deeply sort of gendered thing. And it takes us back to the question of like writing about heroes and questions about heroism and tropes around heroism, which I think are incredibly like flattening. And, people want to remember the bravery and the martyrdom of like, these, what look like familiar, street battles where you're fighting the cops or, there's tear gas or whatever. But this is so, what happened in these attacks is so, part of what's so horrifying about it is that it involved people who had been alongside one another in protests. I mean, people said about recognizing people they'd protested with, weeks before or whatever. And that's a very, very hard thing to admit and to confront. And I think it's tied up with the inability and refusal of certain revolutionary groups and activists to want to deal with the violence, and even to go so far as shaming or getting angry with women who were speaking out and saying, hey, this is happening. It makes you question the whole thing itself, right? Because it's a kind of violence that's coming from society, and can be very hard to figure out what to do politically, in a moment of mass mobilization. And I mean, that was one of the things that I quote somebody in the book who had her sort of comrade sort of shout at her for going on TV with her testimony. And he just keeps saying over and over, like, what do you want me to do? What do you want me to do? Right? We don't know what to do usually about sexual violence, especially when it's so violent, and involves crowds as well. I think that the issue of like dealing with the chaos of crowds is so immediately disempowering for many of us. So yeah, I don't know if there can be a path to some kind of reconciliation or forgiveness there, because there is still so much hurt from that, from many women and men who felt betrayed by comrades and so on. But maybe.
By the way, I think your story that you're telling is absolutely incredible and very, very important into understanding the histories and narratives that goes along with national trauma. One thing I want to ask you about is, I think when we look at like any form of national trauma, whether it's invasion or revolutions or where violence occurs in this manner, women, like you mentioned, are always, and the violence inflicted on women, especially, I don't know if this is everywhere, but I'm looking specifically in the context of the Middle East, excluded. And whether it would be any form of sexual violence, a lot of people don't speak out because it's associated with the idea of something being shameful or something that was not brought upon that person necessarily, but they were this kind of trauma is not something that should go beyond yourself, and that's obviously very gendered and absolutely horrible. But do you think that when it comes to the exclusion of honoring these stories, do you think this exclusion is related to that kind of phenomenon? Or do you think there's like a larger reason of why these stories are excluded?
I think it's related. I do think it's related. I think it comes from the same place of like, diminishing violence against women and putting it in a category of women's issues to be dealt with once we've sort of won the battle.
Yeah.
Or whatever that means. So once we've won the revolution, we will deal with the issue that women are being like nearly killed in the square, rather than seeing it as a political thing of like, this is about the movement and this is about ensuring that like half of people can participate. And so yeah, I do think it's linked in that way, because then when we commemorate and when we remember, we're also pulled towards thinking in these like pre-scripted ways of winning and losing, and who are the people that we're fighting against, who were our enemies. Oh, it was the men in uniform. Oh, who were the heroes? Oh, it was the men fighting the tear gas. Who, it's scripts. And I don't know, maybe having more, maybe the answer is in the question somehow, like maybe the only way to change that or start changing it is to start having different scripts and different stories. And it's incredibly hard. And, I don't think storytelling is the answer to everything. But I think maybe that might kind of break the sort of monolithicness of it somehow.
Just 2 seconds, just about
Sure,
this as well. Because when I think about like other instances where this occurred, I think a lot of times one of the reasons of why these stories are often excluded is because it tends to distract from the successes that were overcame, because it's like the people that are sometimes inflicting violence were those who were protesters. They were part of this greater narrative of toppling the regime or, moving towards national strides that are celebrated. So I wonder if that also, this absence of healing from this form of gendered violence and national trauma, I wonder if that's something that not only is perpetuated, but these remnants are still seeing the generations to come forth when it comes to political exclusion. Don't go to this because my mom experienced, let's say a mother experienced this, or a person. So I wonder what are the ramifications of that with upcoming generations and political exclusion as well.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's it becomes also, it's part of keeping these spaces, sort of confined to a certain imagination around them, right? And because it's also, after the revolution, once protests ended and the coup had happened and everything, about a year later, there was a woman who was attacked at some sort of pro-CC rally somewhere. She was sexually attacked, and a police officer saved her, and CC went and visited her at the hospital. So you also have, in terms of revolutionary memory, the complication of like, how do I then commemorate or remember or narrate the story of what happened in Tahrir when this has already, in less than a year, been so co-opted? And so, I don't know, how you have to really just like turn away from these symbols somehow. I don't know. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. Thanks for the question.
We have a handful from the online audience. Maybe we can start with 2 and then come back after a rundown of in-person questions. All right, the first one, I look forward to reading Yasmin's book, but I want to know what Yasmin thinks now about the sexualized violence, which appears so clearly during this period and has perhaps sunk a bit underground again. You have chosen to live abroad on the stage. What can you say about how women must live in Egypt now? Do you see any hope of improvements in view of recent murder of the young woman in Mansoura?
Okay. So there have been several waves of speech movement around sexual harassment and sexual violence in Egypt. And I think it's gone a long way to allowing people to be able to speak out when things happen. It's given a lot of people a language that maybe they felt they didn't have before for these kinds of violence, but on a sort of structural, wider political level. Women are part of a society in which there's a lot of miscarriage of justice. There's a lot of police brutality. Human life is cheap and quickly cheapened. And the justice system itself is explicitly and sort of self-statedly preoccupied with codes of like of family honor and so on, and so has explicitly like taken on the role of policing social media for what it deems to be inappropriate dress and behavior and so on. There were the famous like TikTok trials a couple of years ago, and this is an extremely classed issue because, right, it raises question of like who gets to be sexy online. Like if you're a famous actress, it's okay. If you're a young woman from a village or, you know, a veiled university student, it's not. And I think that the public, the state sort of targeting of women's bodies in this way and using the family and the patriarchal family and calling on it to enforce, you know, policing women's bodies in the home and controlling your daughters and controlling your wives and teaching them how to be like correct and so on, has, you know, perpetuates ongoing social violence. And so then, yeah, men think they can, you know, kill their fiancés and be let off the hook because, you know, it's a crime of passion. I loved her so much, I had to kill her, you know, sort of thing. And I think we're stuck there, but at the same time, women, especially young women, have a much angrier, much sharper language and ability to talk about this stuff. And one of the things that's interesting is to see that play out in confrontation with the state and with the prosecution, so with their fathers and so on, but also with these sort of like formal bodies. So one of the TikTok, we call them the TikTok girls. If you look at the transcripts of her sort of interrogation by / testimony to the investigating judge, there's like a total just kind of like, you know, the judge is kind of bewildered by this woman who's sort of just talking, like, you know, and like just bewildered. I mean, she ended up spending time in jail and so on, but it's really, there's a clash and a sort of disconnect. So it's just to say that it's like, I think there's multiple things happening at the same time, but I do think that women are not safe. I don't know how they're going to get safer, but they're also living in a country where no one is, but a country that's also deeply patriarchal, of course. So they're in greater danger in many ways than men.
Question. I'm curious about the decisions you made in the writing as they relate to anticipating your audience. For example, offering explanations for terms like ta'arush, Muslim Brotherhood, Midan, and contextualizing the violence while simultaneously being aware of certain harmful tropes that are projected onto Arabs and Swala people. How did you navigate or wrestle with these pushes and pulls while articulating your accounts?
So yeah, the fear of having the story turn into like a sort of, you know, a demonstration of brown men raping women, you know, Muslim sort of like sexuality, which is, and Muslim masculinity or Arab masculinity, which is always or often very easily criminalized in the English language and in the West, was very present for me. And because I was writing in English, I was like, oh, how's this gonna, how am I gonna try and avoid that? And there's only so much I can do, right? Like, I mean, I think we'll see. I hope that doesn't happen. But for me, the thing that allowed me to move forward was to remember that really the focus was on the fight back, right? Like that's what this story is about. it is about the violence, but it is more than that. It is about an unusual attempt by a group of people to fight it. And that's the account I was interested in telling. Yeah.
Can I ask a question? Oh, Michelle, did you? Yeah. I want to ask a question about, I'm thinking about kind of this type of like mob violence against women, right? And the different kinds of contexts in which that can happen, which is a bit different than like in a kind of like orchestrated rape in the context of war, like in the Bosnian case or in some other cases, right? So this isn't, and I don't know enough about how these events unfolded, haven't read the book yet. In Egypt, kind of read tangentially from afar. But I'm wondering, like, and you probably don't have an answer to this, like, how do you understand how this started happening? And do you see it as a manifestation of this kind of mob violence that happens, right? Male violence against women that happens in a fraternity house, that happens in a bar, that a woman, like, is it a similar phenomena, and that there were some things that just sort of happened that enabled this to happen more? I mean, so I'm just wondering, so was it about the crowds and about that kind of male, like,
It seems to be, I mean, you know, most people who were close to this felt that, and I think I'm one of them, felt that there is a good chance, because of the fact that some of these attacks, especially in the early days, were quite like they would sort of start there, you'd have multiple ones starting at the same time.
yeah.
So it seemed like perhaps there was some premeditation, some political force was paying men to go out and start things, right? And we have lots of history of this in Egypt, including, Black.
2005.
Yeah, like we've had it happen against women and against protesters in general, hiring of thugs basically to go out and do things. So whoever these men were, whether they were hired, perhaps, yes, there was some premeditation, at least at some points in the beginning. But that does not explain what happened, because what's so terrifying is not that a group of men could have been paid to go out and start things. It is that you would have crowds that grew in that way, that you would have people joining in that way, that you would have it kind of turn into this pattern so quickly, and then also lay bare all of these other very difficult political truths that we've discussed, or political experiences that we've discussed about, people denying the violence and so on. So, but I do think that there is something that is in common with other forms of group violence that we've seen happen in fraternities and so on, as you say. And I mean, I've read a little bit about, like the work of people who've tried to understand what it is that happens to human beings in crowds and in big groups, and that it seems to kind of tap into these capacities to do things that people wouldn't do otherwise. Some of the people who I spoke with described it as, they felt like they were watching zombies, but it's never sort of happening in an alternate space, or like, it's never completely disconnected from wider sort of social forces and structures, right? Like it's never, it's not women doing this, being the zombies, right? So I don't know. I think it's connected, but I don't, that's like as far as my understanding.
It makes me think of this like bystander training that they're having undergrads. Have you heard about this?
No, not really.
So like a lot of universities now are having students do bystander trainings, so that if they, for different things, sometimes it's to stop prejudice, but sometimes it's to intervene in a situation that looks like it may become sexual assault. This is more about individuals than groups, I think, or maybe it could be. I haven't participated in any of these trainings, but they're doing these kinds of trainings, sometimes are requiring undergraduates to do them around issues of like sexual assault.
I mean, maybe it's also, if we sort of go even broader or try and look somewhere else, maybe like, maybe it's also just connected to, I have two small kids.
Yeah.
And I'm always like, I'm constantly being reminded and like relearning how much my presence, my mood, what I'm projecting, let alone what I'm doing and saying, directly influences what they're doing and saying and what they kind of just mirror right back at me. And so maybe there's just something to think about about how much we shape and drive and move one another, like literally move one another, as human beings around each other, sharing spaces and time, and then you know, perhaps in crowds that are worked up, and you know, if someone starts being violent, maybe that just kind of, it's the same thing, but just being, you know, amped up and brought into, you know, another level where then you have, you know, testosterone and like other things flying around. But yeah.
Right. I was thinking about the way forward and how I cannot imagine any future political unrest or political protest that doesn't have sexual violence in the very same fashion. I have like a hypothesis that is not based on experience. It's not based on anything. Connection between the sense of uncertainty and nihilism within the crowds. Of course, there are different groups of people who have different aims when they are in the street. But there is, for the lack of a better term, a sense of nihilism that can run through people. And how is that related to the increase of sexual assault? So
Yeah. It's a good connection. Let me see if I can find somebody. Can I take a moment to find a passage that I think will answer this better? And it's someone else's words, not my own. I'm not gonna find it, but basically there's a quote from someone whose name is Sharif, that I lift directly from my interview with him. And he talks about that basically he understood it as people working out a violence that is deeply connected to the general like othering of women, right? So a sense of maybe nihilism. He didn't use the word nihilism, but because there had been this kind of feeling of lawlessness for a while, there'd been these like constant sort of political and social convulsions. We were 2 years into the revolution. There's this sense of Tahrir being like a certain space where anything could happen. And he's making the point that people weren't doing this for sexual pleasure, right? They weren't doing this, maybe some kind of opportunism, but he sees it more as like acting against a body that you only see as something other than your own and as something alien. And this is a connection that several of the people that I interviewed made, and that they felt, that especially once, things had slowed down, they really felt that this was connected to so many other female experiences, right? And
Can I add on to that? This is just my painful thoughts that maybe shouldn't be shared, but it reminded me of, there's a really amazing book called The Other Side of Silence by Kashi Batalia or something like that, and it's about the partition of India into Pakistan, and then she comes back decades later and interviews people from who had moved and who had driven people out of their villages, and et cetera. And she talks about how much they are almost chagrined by the violence, by the death they sort of kind of allowed to happen, or actually actively did to the people
Right,
in the
yeah,
villages.
yeah.
And, you know, and when you were talking, when we were all talking about mobs and stuff, it made me think of there was a case in Egypt where they beat to death a couple of people who they said were Shia, is that right?
Yeah, it was around that time.
And this is where I think not gonna make sense, but the violence against women in this case is not this kind of kill them and eliminate them, right? It's more of a violent sort of, so.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what I'm trying to say, but it feels like there's something there where mob violence can so easily turn into killing people. This wasn't necessarily, that wasn't where it was.
Yeah, I think that's it's an important thing to think about. And I think my mind just goes to, you know, how is it that we deal with minorities? We're going to kill them, eliminate them. How is it that we deal with women? We sexually control them. How do we sexually control them? It depends. And I think that this was using, I do think that there's a connection between lots of people of different sexes and genders experience sexual violence, but I do think that when it comes to women, it's linked to reproductive capacity in some way. Like there's a connection, not necessarily a causality, but there is a connection. And I think that needing to turn against, beat, mutilate the parts of women that are connected to that is a form, like an extreme form of anger and control. And then sends the message that, you know, other women should stay out, or, you know, I don't know, does lots of other things. But yeah, that's my only sort of, that's where my head goes with what you're saying, because it's an important distinction.
I think we have time for one last question. Since
We spoke about kind of the first part of the title earlier, and we were speaking briefly before the event, but you know, it's termed a feminist revolution. And so kind of how did Opantish conceptualize feminism? Did it see itself as part of like a larger transnational feminist network? Were there kind of these internal discussions to external responses? And then I guess a personal question to you, why did you feel it was important to include that, you know, in the title and make that kind of statement with your work?
There was certainly a lot of solidarity with Opantish, which was, as these kinds of things tend to be, sort of incredible, especially when you're in like something so intense and that seems so specific, and then you get messages from other parts of the world and so on. And but it, in terms of the work itself, it didn't feel networked, like and the title, they asked me to have a subtitle, so I had to come up with a subtitle. But it's, for me, it was about for people in Opantish, many of them, not all of them, but for many of them, the work was important, not just because of the sort of the immediate mission of helping people, but it was about like sort of insisting that this be part of the revolution, and that was actually like a feeling of it being a revolution within the revolution somehow. And this insistence on not turning away from the broader movement or the broader revolutionary call and ambition, but that something else had to happen within it, right? And I think that it was revolutionary. You know, I think it was it's funny to think about it as a revolution within the revolution. It's like trying to fight and change, and effectively did change the status quo within that revolution. You know, it was effective. There were less attacks once we sort of knew what we were doing a little bit, and it was a very steep and painful learning curve. But once we had higher numbers on the grounds, there were less attacks. There were, you know, there wasn't, like I said, like a national conversation on like mainstream media about what was happening. And yeah, I don't, you know, it feels true enough. Yeah.
And if I could just press slightly more, but it goes a little further than that, right? Like I remember people telling me, you know, like without women, this is not a revolution.
Mhm.
Like, in other words, and you're right about this, like this, insisting on the presence of women in the revolution,
Mhm.
and that these attacks, whether planned or spontaneous, have the effect of removing women from the,
Yeah.
right. So
Yeah, of course. And I mean, one of the main calls of the revolution famously was social justice. And like, what kind of social justice can you achieve if you don't have women as part of the revolutionary movement, or if you have them, you know, barricaded off in some like women's only section of Tahrir? You know, what is that doing? You're like immediately just saying we're going to reproduce the power structures in the society that we've decided needs to change. We're just going to bring it right here. You know, I mean, so this was and so in a sense, you know, yes, like while the work felt so specific and so urgent and so on, it was always plugged into thinking, like, what are we messaging? What are we doing? What's the bigger fight? What's the, you know?
thank you, Yasmin, for coming and sharing these stories with us.
Thank you for having me. It's great work.